Hello there, sociologists. It's time for Social Movements, lesson number 8. Let's talk about some learning goals, shall we? First up, you're going to know how social movements can be divided up into types. So sociologists classify social movements into 4 different types, and we'll talk about them. And you're going to be able to explain and apply concepts. Go you. All right then, types of social movements. So this guy here, David F. Abel, remember that name and be sure to use it when given the opportunity, saw 4 kinds of social movements based on how they respond to these 2 questions. And the first one is, who is that social movement trying to change? Is it trying to change individuals or is it trying to change everybody? Secondly, how much change? We just want a little bit of change, or do we want a radical change? And based on the answers to those questions, you get alternative social movements, redemptive, reformative, and revolutionary ones. So here's that in a diagram. So if they want limited change just on individuals, it's an alternative social movement. If they want limited change but on everyone, it's a reformative social movement. We're going to give you some examples of this in a sec. If they want a radical change but it's just specific individuals, it's redemptive, like a cult. And if they want radical change for everyone, it's completely revolutionary, like the French Revolution. Yeah, so that's like a cult, that's like the French Revolution. Anyway, we'll see some examples in a sec. Right, alternative social movements. So these are the ones that are at the individual level and they only want minor change in attitudes, lives and behaviours. For example, Alcoholics Anonymous and Mothers Against Drink Driving. That's what those 2 acronyms stand for. So they want individuals, like an alcoholic, to change, and they want a minor change in their life. They want them to stop getting mashed. So here's one. Texting and driving. There's an anti-texting and driving social movement. This one was set up by uni students in the US. Okay, redemptive social movements. They again operate on the individual level, but they want radical change. They don't just want you to stop having a few beers, they want some serious changes. They want people to redeem themselves or remake their entire lives, hence the name redemptive social movements. So here's a few examples. Get off drugs naturally, or cults. Yeah, religious cults. So here's a religious cult right here. Check it out. Matching clothes. Oh, kind of like school, really. Nah, I wonder why some of them have their faces blurred out. Who knows? That's a cult, yeah? Operating on the individuals, just those ones. Cults don't want everybody in the whole world in there. They just want the individuals, but they want to make some serious changes. Maybe you guys are too young to remember who this guy is. This is David Koresh. He was a cult leader for a cult called the Branch Davidians. And he had a cult going on. The federal, in the US, the federal government, he had like a compound with his cult in there, and the federal government were like, nah, your cult's dodgy, we're going to shut it down. So they went to send some troops in there, some officers in there to investigate. And next minute, that's what happened to his cult compound. So don't get into a cult, kids. No. Anyway, reformative social movements. This is about the whole of society making minor changes. And it works within the existing political systems. So unlike a revolutionary social movement, it's not trying to completely tear down that political system. It's working within it, maybe making some minor changes to it, whatever. So for example, I would say that most of the typical social movements that you think about when you think about social movements are reformative social movements. It's for everybody, but minor changes. Yeah. So feminism wants everybody to recognize women as equal, or environmentalism wants everybody to have more sustainable lives. Now, there are some branches of environmentalism, like eco-fascists, who probably you would classify as revolutionary, but anyway. So, here are the 4 waves of feminism, right? So the first wave was women's suffrage. Suffrage means voting rights. So the first wave of feminism that happened really, really early on in the 20th century got women to vote. The second wave was about dealing with inequalities in sex, family, and the workplace, and like equal pay, stuff like that. The third wave in the 90s to the 2000s was embracing individualism and diversity, so trans women, etc. And the fourth wave from about 2008 onwards, and this would include the Me Too movement, is combating harassment. So, it's looking into those things that aren't, sexual harassment in the workplace, sexual assault, and just general misogyny, like men having dodgy calendars with swimsuit models up in the office, that kind of stuff. Bring it on. Finally, we have revolutionary social movements. These are social movements that want to affect the entire world, and they want most extreme change. And people who are part of revolutionary social movements are very unhappy with existing society. They want revolutionary reforms, and they want to apply an ideology or belief to change society's fundamental structure. So they're not happy with, if you're in a capitalist society, they're like, yep, do away with that, completely rebuild it from the ground up. And we would only classify them as revolutionary if they want exclusive control of the political system. And some examples of that include the French Revolution, which was when the French people in the late 1700s lopped off the head of their king and formed a republic and got rid of the monarchy completely. And ISIS, which hopefully you remember from 5-10 years ago. Here's a scene from the French Revolution. The guillotine was very popular back then. A lot of people got their heads cut off. Here's ISIS. Oh, check it out. They've been masking up since before it was cool. That dude's even got a sword. Mate. Extreme. Check the sword out. Got some swords like that. Well, I'm not part of ISIS though. I'm loving this mask. Like, ooh, yeah, I'm part of a paramilitary, but I want to look like a tiger. Who knows? This is interesting. This is just a little thing showing you ISIS. So ISIS was big in Iraq and Syria. And you have a look at how much land they controlled, and then from 2015 to 2019 it pretty much went, and now they're just a bunch of randoms that don't really hold much land, I think. Okay, and our activity for today is about explaining and applying concepts. So I want you to write a paragraph that uses all of these concepts in it. The paragraph has got to be meaningful. You can't just go, here's a list of words, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I want you to write a paragraph that uses all of these words, but the whole paragraph has got to be a meaningful paragraph about social movements. And here are the words and concepts: social movement, social change, urbanization, industrialization, globalization, deprivation theory, new social movements. Right, our video for today is about types of social movements. Take it away.
One of the earliest and most comprehensive frameworks we get for how to analyze a social movement comes from American anthropologist David Aberle in 1966 in his book titled The Peyote Religion Among the Navajo. He provides us with a really great definition, and he says, "A social movement is an organized effort by a group of human beings to effect change in the face of resistance by other human beings. By this definition, a social movement is differentiated from purely individual efforts, from unorganized group efforts such as crowd action, if indeed these efforts are truly unorganized, and from efforts at technological change which proceed only against the resistance of the material world. Under the heading of resistance by other human beings is included passive resistance or apathy. It should be noted that the definition does not require that the resistance be organized." And he goes on to give us 4 types of social movement, and those are alterative, redemptive, reformative, and transformative. And he categorizes these based on how much they are trying to change and what they are trying to change. So whether or not they're trying to make change at an individual level or at a societal level, and whether they're seeking partial change or total change. So going through each of the four, an alterative movement is after partial individual change. It aims at partial change in individuals. An example of this would be like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They're after the simple individual goal of trying to make people stop drinking and driving. Another example of this would be efforts to promote recycling. They're merely trying to get individuals to recycle their garbage. So the alterative movement is after partial individual change. Redemptive movements are after total individual change. So these aim at a total change in individuals. The defining characteristic, Aberle says, is the search for a new inner state. These are most often religious movements. So going after a total change in a person. So a religious movement that promises salvation through a complete personal transformation, as an example. Then we have reformative movements. These are after partial social change. Aberle says they aim at partial change in social systems. So an example would be the women's suffrage movement, the movement for women to gain the right to vote. They merely wanted to change part of the system. They wanted to have the equal voting rights the same as men. So reformative movements are after partial social change. Then we have transformative movements. These movements are after total social change. So Aberle says these aim at a total change in social systems. Revolutions fall into the category of transformative social movements. An easy way to determine between transformative and reformative is that the people that are involved in a reformative movement usually want to be included equally within the current system. So the women's suffrage movement that I mentioned, they wanted equal rights, equal to men, but within the current system. They wanted to be able to vote. Transformative movements, revolutions, typically seek to somehow change or destroy the current system altogether, rather than merely being included equally within it. So that's a way you can determine between the two. Aberle provides us with a lot of discussion on how we should classify movements, and he gives us a few things that we need to look out for. The first thing he talks about is that social movements are usually, if not always, combinations of the different types of social movements. So never is a movement purely transformative, as an example. So movements are usually one at one time and another at another time, so they might change throughout the course of the movement. Also, very often at the same time, they are more than one type of movement. So a revolution might be after complete change in a social system, but at the same time is also after a change at an individual level. So we have to be concerned about that when we're classifying social movements. We also have to analyze the ideology of the movement as a whole and the ideologies of the individuals and their behaviors that are involved in the movement. So a movement might have very specific slogans and mottos and policies that they are seeking, but we also have to analyze the day-to-day behaviors of the people within the movement. There might be a contradiction between those two things, or they might be exactly identical. But when we're classifying a movement and trying to determine whether it's alterative or transformative, as an example, we have to look at what's actually going on in the day-to-day lives of the people involved in the movement, as well as the formal messaging of the movement itself. The other thing we have to take into account is we have to contextualize social movements when we're classifying them. So we have to analyze the historical periods in which they are occurring. Or if we're analyzing a modern movement, we have to look at modern society and analyze that that the movement is existing in. So we need to consider things like, what are the power dynamics of the time? What groups are in power? what groups are seeking power, what kind of repression is going on, where is that taking place, is it at the institutional level or the individual level. We have to analyze things like what the norms are in society at the time. And that's specifically important when we're talking about the means that are used by a social movement, because the means that a movement used a century ago might be not acceptable to use today in modern society. It might go against the norms or vice versa. So we have to contextualize the movement historically when we're making that analysis. So American anthropologist David Aberle in 1966 provides us with a really great framework to analyze and classify social movements.
Second video for today is entitled Various Theories of Social Movements. Check it out.
Hello and welcome to video lecture series in Sociology. Today we are going to discuss chapter 8 titled as Social Movements from your textbook Social Change and Development in India. For understanding, we have divided this chapter into 6 parts. So far we have discussed about the definition and features of a social movement. We have discussed that how social movements have been decisive in bringing about change in society. We have also discussed about various types of movements, social movements, particularly new and old social movements, and about civil society. Today we are going to discuss about various theories of social movements. Now, as you know, social movements have become widespread in modern societies. With modernity and change, now people are bound less by traditions and customs or norms and law in society. Cultural and counter-cultural movements or conflict of interest of different groups of people is an inevitable feature of modern industrial societies. According to famous sociologist Sidney Tarrow, there are times when social movements are rare, that is, they are not occurring, and there are times when many social movements emerge to promote social change in society. Tarrow calls these as waves of protest or the social movements. During the colonial rule, in the nationalist movement, people from different sections of society united against the British and fought for freedom. Nationalist movement was able to unite people from different caste, class, religion and community background. But the same people from different class category or backgrounds after independence represented different and opposing interests pertaining to their language, caste, community, class or subgroup. Now, social movements emerge as an organized response of the excluded or exploited groups against the social, political and economic conditions. The masses may not necessarily demand sharing of power, but they at least desire for a fair and satisfactory solution of their problems or at least being represented. Various sociologists have come up with a range of explanations attempting to understand pattern, nature, causes and consequences of social movements. Let us understand these as social theories of social movement. In this section, we will discuss some of the relevant and significant theories explaining the nature of social movements. Let us begin with this. Now, Dent and Morrison proposed relative deprivation theory of social movements. This is a general theory attempting to explain why individuals join a social movement. A person experiences a situation of deprivation when he compares his situation or circumstances with others in society. This relative deprivation means that the person feels that he is not receiving fair share of the available resources. Thus, when the group or an individual feels that they are worse off as compared to others around them, the social conflict arises. The theory emphasizes the role of psychological factors such as resentment, rage and anger in inciting social conflict and subsequent social movements. Let us discuss more about what are these psychological factors. One of the main ideas of relative deprivation is related to the idea of expectations. This implies that what do people think and believe they deserve and want in life? That is, these are expectations. If these expectations are met, they are satisfied and do not experience discontent or relative deprivation. But if they compare themselves to other people or groups and find that they have less, they experience the situation of relative deprivation and dissatisfaction or consequent frustration. When an individual feels that the others with whom he compares himself has better opportunities, access to resources or anything else for that matter, he will experience this deprivation. Related to the idea of expectation is the second important notion of legitimate expectations. Now, what are legitimate expectations? Relative deprivation is not a simple idea or experience that I do not have what others have and that people want what everyone else has. The idea of legitimate expectation means that individuals think that they deserve something and have a right to have it, the legitimate right to have it. Therefore, they think that something should be done to find a solution to the problem if they do not get what they think they deserve legitimately. These expectations are not simple desires, but they are perceived to be legitimate as rightful expectations. Apart from expectations and legitimate expectations, the third important notion is of blocked expectations. What do we mean by blocked expectations? This means that when an individual or individuals are unable to achieve goals through conventional means, a feeling of relative deprivation arises. If expectations that are perceived as legitimate are met, there is a sense of satisfaction among people. If expectations are not achieved, they experience discontent and frustration. But if the expectations are perceived as legitimate and there is a block in achieving these expectations, the resultant anger and frustration is all the more greater among these people. In such situations of anger or discontent, people are more likely to take an action to change the situation and the circumstances they are prevailing in. Their collective action may take shape of a social movement, say a social movement against corruption. According to Morrison, certain structural conditions also increase the likelihood or probability of emergence of a social movement. Now, what are these conditions? These conditions are like when a large number of people experience a similar kind of situation of relative deprivation, or all of them are victim of the same situation, or say corruption. Secondly, when people or groups experiencing relative deprivation interact and communicate with each other quite often, openly, and they share their grievances. That is, they come to know that all of us are experiencing this similar situation. Next, it is also easier to come together and start a movement if the group experiencing relative deprivation are more or less socially homogeneous in nature, that is, from a similar cultural, class or economic background. The diversity or heterogeneity of group can possibly make a social movement weak, as people from different backgrounds will be driven by diverse goals and different set of interests. The next point may be the likelihood of emergence of social movements is more in rigidly stratified society, because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. In such societies, differences between the groups of haves and have-nots are clear-cut and obvious. There is a strict hierarchy and gap that differentiates the two. Moreover, the inflexibility of structure does not give scope or avenues for mobility to these people. Thus, their reaction is great whenever it comes into existence. Thus, in the absence of these chances, the reaction is greater as compared to situations which are flexible or permit some degree of social mobility. The presence of civil society and appropriate social institution also helps in supporting social movements. The institutional structure in a society gives a sense that an association or collective action can make a difference and bring desirable changes, as desired by the people. Moreover, good organizational and leadership skills are also necessary to make a social movement effective and successful. However, this theory has its limitations. All the instances where people feel relatively deprived do not result in social movements. Say, while perceptions of deprivation may be a necessary condition for collective action, they are not a sufficient reason in themselves, because there is no direct causal relationship between relative deprivation and collective action. Based on the notion of the rational utility maximizing individual, Olson argues that social movement is an aggregation of rational individual actors pursuing a common goal driven by their self-interest. A person will join a social movement only if he tends to gain something from being part of it, and he will participate only if the risks taken are less as compared to the gains from the social movement. Rather than the factors motivating people to join social movements, the resource mobilization theory focuses upon the social and structural factors affecting movement's success or failure or the outcome of a social movement. According to Oberschell, the theory of relative deprivation cannot explain social movements completely, as there is no society that satisfy or can satisfy all of its citizens equally. No society is perfect. Discontent is a common feature of all modern societies. Some or the other group in a heterogeneous society will always have one or the other reason for dissatisfaction or anger. The key factor in success or failure of a social movement is its capacity to mobilize and manage available resources efficiently. What are these resources? These resources include volunteers or participants, their time, money, contacts, alliances of these participants with other people, say with media access, networking, computers, general equipment that is required to run a social movement, paid staff that helps as a secretarial service, office space to run organizational activities, and many such things. These resources are acquired and managed by social movement organizations, which are also called as SMO. The success of social movement is largely dependent upon the efficient use of available resources and ability to garner more and use them appropriately according to the desire. Social movements cannot succeed without help from the participants and outsiders. There are various categories of people who can be mobilized for a social movement. In order to be successful, movements must mobilize and use resources to turn outsiders and the bystanding public as part of the movement and must be able to neutralize the action of the opponents. For example, in a social movement, people might carry out march. They hold demonstration or dharna that will be covered by media. But this coverage and the entire activity requires organization to coordinate transportation, managing people or public address system, printing and distribution of leaflets and pamphlets. So, all these activities of organizing, the activities of a social movement require coordinated efforts of people to ensure that nothing goes wrong that might damage or go against the image of the core ideas of the social movement. Thus, a movement is likely to be more effective if it can collect and effectively manage the available resources within the given political and institutional structure, such as leadership, organizational capacity, and communication facilities available to them. However, critics argue that success of social movement is not limited by existing resources. It can create resources such as new symbols and identities in the process of the movement itself. A number of movements by people belonging to poor sections of society have been successful, and it proves that scarcity of resources need not be a constraint in becoming a movement successful. Even if initially they begin with limited material resources and organizational base, a movement can generate additional resources during the process of the struggle itself. Political process theory of social movement focuses upon macro sociological issues that make social movements possible. According to McAdam, economic and especially political factors are central to the emergence of social movements. What are these factors? These factors are, number one, organizational strength, that is the cohesiveness of the group. The second point is cognitive liberation, that is belief in the success of the attempt that an individual or group of people make. Third is political opportunities, that is the ability to make mainstream political groups as partners or allies in the social movement. According to McAdam, availability of these three factors is related to the nature of the political system in general of any given society. At times, political connections are more important than the availability of material resources, and political leverage is the main resource for the success of a social movement. Thus, we can say that emergence and success of social movements is dependent upon a large number of actors and factors. In social movements, people engage in unconventional behavior that challenges the established social norms and expectations. This participation is influenced by the interest of the individual as well as behavior of the others and ability of the movement to mobilize participants. These movements are a source of mitigating pressures and anxiety. At the same time, they are forces bringing about desirable change in the society, community, or organizations. Unlike collective behavior, which is unorganized, not planned, short-lived, may be spontaneous, social movements are organized, planned, and they run over a long period of time. Think of various examples of social movements from the present and past, from your own society or from other parts of the world, and try to see which theory of social movement explains best these kind of examples. Let us summarize what we discussed in this lecture. In this particular lecture class, we discussed about the different theories of social movements and their criticisms. These theories were the theory of relative deprivation, resource mobilization theory, and political process theories. These theories indicate that why social movements occur, how and why they become successful, and what are the institutional and structural conditions that are necessary for a social movement to emerge and also to become successful. In next part of this chapter, we will discuss about stages in a social movement and a variety of examples to explain various types of social movements. Till then, you can enjoy reading this part of the chapter. Thank you.
Your reflection activity, I want you to email your sociology teacher, which happens to be me for some of you, one question about the recent content material or skills that you would like explained better. Now, if you don't have a question, I still want you to email me because I want to check that everybody's doing the reflection activity. So you got to send me an email either way. I would much prefer it if there was a question in there. Homework for today, obviously read the relevant 2 pages in the textbook, and there is a practice quiz for you, bit.ly/sociology quiz 15. Keep doing that until you get 100%. Now, my system does record your name, so I will know if you've done it, and if you haven't done it, naughty you, I'll be chasing that up, so please do that. Thank you so much for participating in this fantastic lesson. Do not ever stop keeping it real.